So this is one of these lectures that I really wish we could be in person for, but we cannot. So we're going to be talking today about the Enlightenment and how that relates to with what we have been talking about with all the different Reformation stuff. And there's going to be some time overlap here, but also kind of what it means for like the future of Christianity, Christian history, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot that's going on there. I kind of have the question up here at the front of, was it even a thing? And that just kind of depends on how you understand the Enlightenment. The same question that comes up with the Renaissance. Um, Older histories are going to draw a much harder line distinction between these different periods of time. You have Middle Ages that ends when the Renaissance begins, and they have as a hard distinction. The Renaissance goes until the Reformation. That's a hard distinction. You have the Reformation until the Enlightenment, and then that's another hard distinction. In actual fact, as you've seen over the course of the semester, these things are overlapping on top of each other. There's not this hard and fast distinction. They kind of flow one into the other. It is still helpful to talk about the ideas in these different terms, because what's going on in the Enlightenment is a little bit different from what we've seen with the Reformation period, but it definitely has connections to that and draws on that. And as you'll see, that there is still a lot of overlap, especially once we start talking about the English Reformation, particularly with what we talked about last time with kind of the Arminian controversy and the rise of Puritanism. That was all contemporaneous with this. So understanding that, you can't really understand a whole lot about it until you also understand the 30 Years' War. So we mentioned it a few times. It's come up in a few different ways. But the 30 Years' War was really a big, big thing. Crazy, bloody conflict. A lot happened in it. Some of the precursors to the war, to kind of understand. So in like 1607, there were a number of things that were taken by the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Emperor during this first period I'm talking about is Emperor Rudolf II, and he, along with Duke of Bavaria, which is part of the Holy Roman Empire, it's in modern day southern Germany. So they worked to actually reestablish Roman Catholicism at a few key areas within Bavaria, which some of these cities had been largely Protestant, and they had managed to establish Roman Catholicism within them. This is largely due to the Bavarian Duke Maximilian I. And even today, Maximilian is considered a hero in a lot of Bavaria, which to this day is still very Roman Catholic in that southern part of Germany. So they successfully reestablished Roman Catholicism, really in the heart of Bavaria. And that kind of starts to work against this idea that was established at the Peace of Augsburg, the curis regio, eius regio, the idea of as the king is, so is the rest of the land. So the people in the city and the people over the city, they were all Protestant. And the Duke of Bavaria, with the endorsement of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, so Maximilian actually is able to do some maneuvering to reestablish Roman Catholicism. So that's kind of the first issue that happens. The second issue that happens is that through an imperial diet, Rudolf II and Maximilian I kind of agree that they will only reaffirm the Peace of Augsburg. Remember, the Peace of Augsburg is what set up that whole doctrine. They will only reaffirm it if lands that were formerly Roman Catholic are returned to the church. Well, now that's a bit of a problem, because that would leave some of the churches without any land at all. And so they seem to be very unlikely to sign on to that. And so in response, you have something called the Protestant Union that forms as a result of that. Frederick IV, who is the elector of the Palatinate, which is another area. So you have like Bavaria and Saxony and Palatinate. There's a few these other areas in the Holy Roman Empire. But Frederick IV, who is a reformed in that Swiss Reformed tradition, he is made the leader of this area. Now, the Protestant Union is unique because it's a little bit different from the Schmalkaldic League, because the Schmalkaldic League was just Lutheran. But the Protestant Union includes both these Lutheran or German evangelical, as well as the Reformed or Calvinist groups. And that forms in 1608. So that forms, the following year, you have something called the Catholic League. And this is the flag for the Catholic League. And again, if you go to Bavaria, this symbol, the kind of blue and white diamond symbol, you'll see in a lot of different places around Bavaria, different places like that. So that's all still there to this day. But it was formed by Maximilian primarily in response to the forming of the Protestant League, the Protestant Union. So the Catholic League, interestingly, lasts for a lot longer than the Protestant Union, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. The third kind of precipitating factor, these are all precipitating factors to the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. So kind of the third thing that happened is what's called the Defenestration of Prague. Now, we talked about an earlier defenestration of Prague when we talked about the Renaissance, or rather, when we talked about Jan Hus, because that's the first one. This is actually the third one, but if you want to talk about the defenestration of Prague, this is usually the one that's referred to of the three. Defenestration is a noun that refers to someone having been thrown out of a window. So the ones who have been thrown out of a window. So here's kind of the lay of the land of what happens. Rudolf, the Holy Roman Empire, gave a lot of concessions to Prague, which was in what then Bohemia, what we now know today as Czech Republic. And so he gave a lot of concessions to them, kind of let them pretty much do their own thing. Part of this was probably to garner support and different things like that. But he is succeeded by his brother first, Matthias, and then later Ferdinand II. And so when Ferdinand II, and this is all in a relatively close period of time, when he comes to the Holy Roman Empire, where the Holy Roman Empire is still very much Roman Catholic. They are, that's the Holy Roman part of the Holy Roman Empire, is that they are Roman Catholic. So Ferdinand II decides that he is going to reimpose Roman Catholicism throughout the entire Holy Roman Empire, which is, again, it's in direct violation of the Cuius Regio, Eius Religio doctrine that had been established in 1555 at the Peace of Augsburg. This was the victory that the Schmalkaldic League had earned. So he wants to reimpose Roman Catholicism throughout the Holy Roman Empire, and he decides he's going to send these representatives to Prague in order to enforce it. Now they submit a letter to the council at Prague. The council is almost entirely Protestant. They do not like this letter. They demand to know who wrote the letter, and they demand an immediate response to some of the questions. These representatives say, "Oh, well, we can't give a response. We have to wait back from the king." And they're like, "No, that's not good enough. We need a response now." And they also say that the king wrote it. Well, eventually, after a lot of questioning and back and forth, it comes out that no, these representatives wrote the letter, but they have the weight and support of the Holy Roman Emperor. So they have his support, and they said, if you're going to punish us, we accept whatever punishment that you decide. They seem to be under the assumption that they would probably, at worst, they were going to be arrested, and then they would just appeal to the emperor, and he would let them out. However, upon hearing that they will accept whatever punishment, the Protestant council grabs hold of the men and forces them out the window and throws them out the window. And this is known as the Third Defenestration of Prague, or the Defenestration of Prague. The successor in the Protestant Union, the successor to Frederick IV, Frederick V, is named the ruler of Prague, and he immediately seeks the endorsement of the Protestant Union. For whatever reason, so this defenestration happens in 1618. In 1620, Frederick V is asking the support from the Protestant Union. For whatever reason, they refuse to support him. They tried to declare themselves neutral, probably for fear that they would be overwhelmed, because the Holy Roman Empire at this time was still, all of the big armies, really. All of the big armies, with the exception of England, you have the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Spain. They're all Roman Catholic. the army that Naples, and the Papal States have. They're there, but they're not. It's really the Holy Roman Empire, mostly modern day Germany, France, and Spain. Those are the ones that they're worried about, and they're like, we don't stand a chance. So they're going to declare themselves neutral in 1620. Don't endorse Frederick the Fifth. They end up dissolving. The Protestant Union dissolves in 1621, but the Catholic League is still in place, and they actually played a big role in this. Now, we're not going to get too much into detail in the histories of everything that happens. We could have an entire course on the 30 Years' War. But this map up here, I'm going to show you. So you have kind of a few different things here. You see this Holy Roman Empire, this brown line is kind of outlining their area. You have the Papal State, the Venetian states, Naples. A lot of this and part of the Holy Roman Empire becomes Italy today. France is more or less the same. Spain is more or less the same. And if you recall from prior lectures, though, the people ruling in Spain and the people in the Holy Roman Empire are both Habsburgs. And right between the two, you have France. So France is a little bit concerned about what's going to happen to them. And so while the 30 Years' War definitely starts off as a religious war between Protestants, both Lutheran and Swiss Reformed, and Catholics, eventually it kind of transforms into France kind of seizing the opportunity to go against the Holy Roman Empire. Interestingly, during this period, you also have the Papal States start supporting, mostly financially, some of these other groups that are going on. And so the Papal States at one point throw their support behind France against the Holy Roman Empire because they're a little bit worried that they're too big. And then eventually they actually start endorsing Swedish people to kind of against the Holy Roman Empire, which is somewhat interesting. So yes, it does start as a religious war, but it definitely transforms into other things as well. And so it goes on. It is, excuse me, sorry about that. Wrong way. Okay, it is a particularly bloody war. Sorry about the quality of the picture here. This is a depiction, this is much later after the fact, of the Peace of Westphalia. So that happens in 1648. It is a diplomatic end to the war. But the outcome of the war is significant. This is a extremely bloody conflict, something like Europe had never seen before. This is entirely in the area of the Holy Roman Empire, that kind of papal area in the northern part of the papal area, and France a little bit, but mostly it's in what is today the Holy Roman Empire. So the overall outcome is that over 8 million people are dead as either a direct or indirect result of the war, either died in conflict or due to starvation or disease that resulted from the conflict. So this is a massive group of people. This is 20% of the German-speaking population of the world at that time. Some regions of the Holy Roman Empire, especially in Bavaria, like around the Black Forest region especially, casualties are as high as 50% of the population. Europe doesn't see proportionate casualties on this scale again until World War II. And so that's a lot of what's going on. There is a treaty that's signed. It eventually serves as kind of the death knell for the Holy Roman Empire. But it's a treaty between the Habsburgs, the French, and the Swedish. End up being the three main groups. And so kind of going back here to this map, that's the time period, and we talked about this a little bit last time, when you have the Netherlands and then Denmark kind of split off from the Holy Roman Empire. And also you have Belgium and Luxembourg then split off from the Netherlands. So that all kind of happens more or less at the same time, that you have these different splits showing up. Just so for some clarity, I believe those yellow portions are the more Lutheran areas, the green are the Swiss Reformed, and then the purple is kind of England doing its own thing. This is kind of what you have going on there, but all these different nation states form as a result of this. It ends up being a big deal. And so a lot of what happens as a result in the Enlightenment intellectually is in response to this massive devastation throughout Central Europe. Not all of it, there are other factors going on as well, but that's definitely one part of it. Another part of it is the discovery of tea and coffee. Now, this doesn't play into some of the early Enlightenment figures as much. Tea was first drunk by Europeans, these are Portuguese, in the 1560s. And then it began to be sold in the 1650s in Europe. There are shops set up. Similarly, coffee became to be a little bit more widely known in Europe in the 16th century through the interactions primarily with Turkish groups. But it's not until 1650s that you start getting the first coffee houses and things like that. And coffee houses are a big deal in the history of the English Enlightenment from the 1650s onward as well. So the two things that both tea and coffee have in common, of course, the one thing that these two have in common is caffeine. So prior to this point, a lot of the intellectual thought, there's some discussion, was centered around, people seated around together drinking wine or beer or that kind of thing. And so, you can't keep the conversation going. At some point, people get too drunk or they're tired or something like that. Whereas caffeine's a stimulant, and so this keeps conversations going longer. And they centered around these coffee shops and not inside people's homes. Coffee houses. Coffee shops is, I guess, a modern thing, but coffee houses. And so you have gatherings of lots of people all hyped up on caffeine, talking to each other about these different ideas. So that's one factor. Now, the kind of exponential growth of tea and coffee, that is largely due to a part of what eventually becomes called the Columbian Exchange, but really what we're talking about here is the slave trade from Africa. So slave trade also begins during this period, and we do have a reading from a former slave who talks about his interactions related to that. So this starts to kind of shift into high gear, especially towards the end of this period. Like once we start getting to the late 1600s into the 1700s, start having a massive scale of slave trade. Most of it actually goes to South America, but a lot of it goes to Europe. Some of it does make its way to America. That is where you start to develop more of a chattel slavery system, where they view people who come from Africa as cattle, and so they want to breed and produce more. So that's why there's less trade there, but still massive amounts of slavery. And it has to do a lot with these different. You have tea and coffee, but also sugar becomes in widespread use, especially in kind of these island areas. Sugar is a big deal. The U.S. is primarily tobacco and cotton. And cotton, actually, the cotton is brought back to Europe, is weaved oftentimes in England, and then spread throughout the rest of Europe as a result. There's a saying that during this period, England clothed Europe. Well, actually, slaves did most of that work. And so you had this horrific thing also going on at the same time, and we'll have a little bit of discussion about that in the comments or on the discussion page. With that said, we're going to get into now the Enlightenment proper and some of the figures in the Enlightenment. A lot of this is based around different figures of the Enlightenment. So the first one that we're going to talk about, though, is in England. This is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a philosopher. He was also a politician. He became Lord Chancellor at one point. He lived during, you can see from the dates there, during the reign of Elizabeth and James. So he kind of saw through a lot of those different changes that were going on and that kind of thing. He lived during part of the 30 Years' War, but he definitely had an understanding of some of the earlier wars of religion that were going on as well. His primary contribution is this aspect that's still present today of the scientific method that's known as confirmation. So he was very instrumental in creating these royal societies for science, where someone would present an idea in a way that they had done to prove it. And the idea here is to get some kind of objective truth. The idea that if not only I get it, but someone else can replicate it and do the same thing and confirm the same result that I have, that gives more credence to the idea. So most of these early Enlightenment figures, just for clarification, they are operating in a more or less Christian context. Francis Bacon was very much had bought into the whole Protestant idea. And the way that kind of Protestantism helps feed into this is that Protestantism began to favor the idea of individuals reading the Bible and coming to their conclusions rather than having one source. The idea that having multiple sources do the same thing and then come together is something that's still present today in a lot of how biblical interpretation is done. And this is one of the things that gives Bacon the idea that for scientific investigation you can do much the same way. You have this book of nature, as it were. So have lots of different people look at it and examine it and dissect it. And then if they all come to the same or very similar conclusions, then that can kind of advance things forward. And that's the idea that Francis Bacon is doing here. Probably a little bit more well-known figure is René Descartes. So René Descartes, Roman Catholic, Frenchman, lived during the 30 Years' War. Most of his life was spent during the 30 Years' War. His famous statement, cogito ergo sum, which is that, just kind of sum up a little bit. He does this thought experiment where he realizes that he can't be sure of anything. And in fact, this idea of skepticism, of a lot more matured skepticism, not naive skepticism, of a matured skepticism, is really instrumental in a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers. And so he starts thinking, I can't be sure of everything. As far as I know, I could be being deceived by an evil daemon, different things like that. So he starts going back and forth about, how can he be sure of anything? And he said, well, the very fact that I am doubting or thinking proves that I exist. Now, this has been called into question more recently, but at the time, this was really groundbreaking. And what Descartes does, because he was also very influential in the sciences and mathematics. We still today use Cartesian coordinate system when we're teaching a lot of basic algebraic concepts. So he's widely influential in a lot of these different areas. But what he does, he starts from that foundational doctrine. I think, therefore I am. So the idea that because there's thought, there must be existence. He starts from that, and he creates what's called foundationalism. And foundationalism is still around today. It has been called into question for a number of reasons. But the idea is, rather than looking to some sort of external source, so rather than looking to, say, something like the Bible or the church, and looking to that as the source for everything that we have, wouldn't it be nice if we could all agree on something? And so the way that we're all going to agree on something is that we're just going to reason to some what we might call foundational or basic beliefs. And for Descartes, he believed that his thought was one of those, that he thinks he exists, and he moves from that very quickly to the existence of other things and the existence of God. Now for Descartes, he thinks that he's acting as a good Roman Catholic. You can kind of see, though, that if you don't have that vested authority in an external source like the Bible or like the church, that it starts to kind of fragment down a little bit. And that definitely is what happens, especially toward the end of this Enlightenment period. But the idea with foundationalism is that you get these foundational beliefs, and then you can build other things up. Those basic beliefs give you the justification for higher beliefs, which gives you the justification for higher beliefs, which give you the justification for even higher beliefs. And so at the top you have these non-basic beliefs. And so if one of these is wrong, well, that must mean you might not have built it right. So there's something wrong at one of the other levels. The idea being that you're never going to take away that foundation. And so that's more or less the understanding of what he's doing there. That does, like I said, come into question. I mean, it comes into question, by the 1800s, people are starting to question this way of thinking. People like Kierkegaard, and especially once you get into the 20th century. Nietzsche, in particular, is a catalyst for questioning thinking. But for our purposes, this is still, this is radical, and this is a different way of doing philosophy. In fact, modern philosophy is often understood to begin with Descartes. So you have that going on. But again, to talk about this idea that it's not a clear distinction between these different time periods, we can also talk about other scientific advances that were going on with someone like Nicholas Copernicus. So Copernicus was born in 1473 and died in 1543. And this is where we start the idea of you don't have a geocentric universe, you have a heliocentric universe. So instead of the Earth being at the center, which is a very Aristotelian way of thinking, um, Ptolemy kind of builds upon this idea, which are these ancient thinkers. So instead of looking at that, we're going to, because of some of the observations that he's noticing, um, he makes a very strong case based upon mathematics and reason here in this early period, this technically pre-Enlightenment period, that the sun is at the center. He says of the universe, today we would now say of our solar system, and our solar system is spinning around a black hole inside of our galaxy, and there is no center to the universe. But this is, again, a radical idea, and that idea is built upon by Galileo. Galileo is a little bit more in our time period, 1564, 1642. Now, Galileo Galilei lives in Italy, or what is modern-day Italy. He is living in Roman Catholic territory. In the 1800s, you have a bit of a revision of the history of why Galileo was rejected. It was not primarily because he argued that the sun was at the center. Yes, that is the ultimate reason. Primarily, though, it's because he's questioning this Ptolemaic and Aristotelian style of thinking, which was endorsed by the church. So if you know anything about Thomas Aquinas is the guy for the church, especially for the Dominicans. And the primary opponents of Galileo are Dominicans. The reason being is that Thomas Aquinas wholeheartedly accepts Aristotelian logic and metaphysics and descriptions of the universe. So if we start calling that into question, we're also calling into question a large part of Thomas Aquinas' work. Thomas Aquinas is where the Roman Catholic Church gets the idea of transubstantiation. So this was not because they just didn't want to listen to observation. There were other deeper reasons behind this. And because the Protestant Reformation had begun and was underway and was in full swing, and you had the Counter-Reformation acting against that, that's why you have this resistance on the part of Roman Catholics to accept the writings of Copernicus and Galileo. So that's a big part of what's going on in that disagreement. And if this were a science and religion class, I could go on and on and on about this debate. It's not, though, so we're going to move on to start talking about some of these other thinkers, and these are all going to be happening in fairly rapid succession of one another. So the next one we're going to talk about is a little bit about Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes, his most famous work is Leviathan, and he introduced this idea of social contract because he is going to fully accept the idea of original sin, and he is going to run with it to an extreme level. Again, at this point, he's still accepting the veracity of Christianity. Later on, his views are somewhat called in question for a lot of other reasons. But he ends up being highly supportive of monarchs and that kind of thing because of this idea of social contract. So he's kind of another thinker that's part of this process. He is responded to by John Locke. John Locke should be particularly well known if you've taken an American history class or anything like that, because the Revolutionary War of America, the French Revolution, these are built upon Locke's ideas. And this is where you start to get a little bit more radical departure. Now, we do have to read that Locke thinks Christianity is the most logical of any response. But for Locke, there are these kind of fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property. And these are related to and endowed by nature. So you start seeing this very gradual shift toward giving a lot more weight to nature and the natural and what the natural does. That probably sees its height with someone like Isaac Newton. So with Newton, his kind of big breakthroughs involving light and optics and gravity in particular, well, he bases it all around mathematics. So you may have seen the meme going around now that during the plague, Newton invented calculus. How bored do you have to be to invent calculus? But he did. He invented calculus. there's a little bit of debate about that, but not much. He probably invented calculus and definitely was able to use and apply it to describe the universe using this mathematical system. That does eventually end up resulting in what's known as deism, where you have this idea that God is not really involved in the day-to-day runnings of the world. And probably, now Newton does write a lot of biblical commentary, actually writes more theological and biblical works than he does scientific and mathematical works. But he probably is a functional deist. This idea that God this is the watchmaker, that God just kind of like winds it up and then lets it go, and then doesn't really involve himself in the day-to-day affairs. This is helping to make sense of why there's all this conflict going on. But also, it's helping to get at a lot more objectivity. No one side can claim that they have the only truth unless they can prove it objectively. And if they could, then others would agree with them. And so that's why there's a lot of this. This whole foundational idea is that, if we share the same foundational beliefs, we should get to the same end. That's what's going on behind a lot of this. And so that's a lot of what Newton is doing, is trying to explain the universe in this foundational way. And it proves to be widely successful from the 1700s on through the 20th century. This is the way of doing physics. It's not until you get kind of the new physics with quantum and relativity and that kind of thing that any of this is called into question. Kind of a rival of his is Gottfried Leibniz, who claimed to have also invented calculus at the same time. There's a lot of evidence that would likely dispute that, but he is also operating in this kind of new reformed, or we might say Calvinist mindset, because he is looking at the world and he is trying to give an explanation for all of this evil and suffering and everything that he sees in the world. And his explanation is that this is still the best possible of all possible worlds. That if you were to lay all worlds side by side, the one that has the overall best outcome is still this world, even with all of this death and destruction that you see from the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, and that kind of thing. This is still the best world, and that God is completely and totally sovereign over that. This is where you have that Reformed Calvinist thinking kind of influencing Leibniz quite a bit. But going back to that idea of nature, you have someone at the same time, Baruch Spinoza, who begins to really question a lot of beliefs. Now, Spinoza, properly speaking, is Jewish, but he is living and working as a lens maker, a lens crafter in Amsterdam. And lenses are really important during this time. So the observations that were done by Copernicus, done by Galileo, are a result of these new lens-making technologies that allow them to do observation. And Spinoza, while he's making the lenses, he's going to try them out. And originally, telescopes were used for ships to see far off, but someone had the bright idea to maybe point it up to the sky. And that's where a lot of these observations come from. So Spinoza, because of what he's seeing in the sky, because of all these other ideas that are going on, he really starts to question whether God is somehow distinct from nature. And in fact, with someone like Spinoza, you start to get really what amounts to pantheism, that God and nature are synonymous, that God is in every single aspect of nature, and that is why it is entirely ordered. And this is where you start to get more of a shift away from orthodoxy more explicitly at this point. And we start moving from this period on into more of what we might call the radical Enlightenment period, where they really begin to question a lot of these basic foundational thoughts. Someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau really questions this idea of original sin. His kind of main argument related to pedagogy is this idea of the tabula rasa, that everyone comes in with a blank slate, blank and clean. They don't have this stain of original sin upon them. In fact, we get to change and shape them due to what happens in their environment. This is a radical idea. And what happens from the Reformation is that as people begin to start thinking for themselves, this idea of the priesthood of believer, that anyone is able to read and interpret the Bible, once that begins to happen, that ends up having this radical shift that ends up resulting in someone like Voltaire. Voltaire, who is, he goes to the point of mocking faith. And if you read Candide, his kind of end conclusion is, look, just let everyone believe what they're going to believe, tend to their own garden, is the way he puts it, and then don't bother them about that. Everyone has a right to believe what they believe, and how dare you try to enforce it? So you kind of see this radical shift away from what you saw with the 30 Years' War. Um, in England, you start having someone like David Hume. Now, Hume really calls a lot of stuff into question. Um, David Hume is very antagonistic to religion and to faith in general. Um, he is, however, very insightful. So on the one hand, he starts promoting, as did someone like Francis Bacon or Isaac Newton, this idea of objectivity and that you obtain it through observation. But then he throws that whole idea of observation into question and has this problem with empiricism. And at the end of the day, he says, like, look, just everyone has their preferences, and really, when we talk about ethics or we talk about religion, we're really just talking about your own personal preference. And Hume's thought, carries on even to today. So a lot of comedic atheists or the new atheists are essentially following in the line of the philosophy of David Hume. Is that, look, just to each his own. I'm glad you like it. That's just not for me. It's all a matter of preference. That is Hume's main argument. In response to Hume, you have someone, and this is where we're going to end today, like Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, actually, his early writing is not very interesting. He himself declares it's not particularly good. But he says that when he read David Hume, it was like a great awakening took place inside of him, and it woke up a sleeping giant, is the way he felt. And what Kant is trying to do is, on the one hand, he's responding to David Hume. He wants to say that, no, it's not just a matter of preference. There is some objectivity to ethics. There is some objectivity to belief. You can know things objectively. You can get at analytic, synthetic truths. For Kant, things like mathematical truths you can get at and you can know that they are true. He's not going to abandon this foundational idea. And actually, in many ways, helps to kind of rescue this foundationalism idea, is what Kant does. But what you get with Kant is, because he's so focused on this universality aspect, and he wants to give it a rational basis, the end result of that is that you have a rational basis now for ethics, a rational basis now for philosophy of life and philosophy of living. It becomes unclear why there's any need for God at all anymore. And in fact, that's why deism and like natural theology with William Paley, immediately after this and lots of things, that's why it really takes off. Because the idea is, well, do we even really need to have a concept of God? What happened throughout the Enlightenment was not that they upended belief in God, but they made it possible to not believe in God and still be considered intelligent, to still live a life, to still live an ethical life. And in some cases, like particularly someone like Voltaire, perhaps even a more ethical life than those who are professing belief in Christianity. So as they are interacting with these other cultures, they're seeing different beliefs, different systems of belief, especially during this kind of later radical period. And it makes it possible to live and think about these kind of deep thoughts without God. And that's really what the Enlightenment does. And it has its roots in Reformation, this idea that I do not need this external authority of the church, but I can come to that authority on my own. During the Reformation, I come to that authority because of God putting His Spirit in me. For Roman Catholics, we come to that authority because it's been handed down from generations, and that authority was vested in Peter by Christ Himself. But once you get to the Enlightenment period, it's like, no, I'm going to find an objective source of authority. Eventually, kind of towards the end of this period, towards the end of the modern period, you see that is authority vested in myself. But at the time, and even for a lot of thinkers today, that is an external authority. It is an authority that is completely objective, that if anyone thought about things in the right way, and you really see that with someone like Immanuel Kant, if you just think about it in the right way, if you just focus on getting your methodology correct, you will get all of the right answers. And so that's a lot of what Kant is doing. is that he's going to focus on epistemology, he's going to focus on ethics, and he's going to focus on aesthetics. That there is an objectivity to whether something is beautiful or not. There is an objectivity to whether something is right or wrong. And there is an objectivity to not only what we know, but how we know it. And the way that we get at that objectivity is just thinking about them in the right way. And the reason that that is so powerful and the reason that works is because it's universalizable. Anybody else, if they follow this method, is going to get to the same conclusions, or at least that's the argument. As I said, in the 20th century, this really gets kind of called in question quite a bit. But at the time, this is a radical argument that happens, and this is really what the big contribution to the Enlightenment is that you have this kind of view or an external source that is not the Bible, that is not the church, that is something else entirely. And a lot of our modern day thinking, even thinking that now goes back to a pre-Enlightenment thinking, can't ever fully shake off this idea. And that's really the contribution that we're looking at here. So, with that said, I'm going to have some discussion posts. Please come along in the discussion post, and I'll see you guys next time.